So um, the the prophecy, at least, is imagining a return to the native land, right? To the land, right? To Jerusalem, to Zion, whatever you want there. Under uh, the political reality is going to be that, or the political reality as we would imagine it would be, right? Not going to be, is that they are going to be subjects of the empire, right? Of the Persian Empire, because it just so happens, or I don't know if it just so happens, but history is that the Persian Empire encompasses now not just Babylonia, but also um, Judea, and there is the opportunity, however this works, for return. Right, you can now. The Persian Empire is allowing repatriation, and now Isaiah is saying in chapter 60 that the you're going to not only are you going to return, we're even going to imagine a world in which the realities of empire, the legal realities of empire, are going to be changed. They're going to change so much, so almost beyond recognition, right? A new way to think of this, right? You're not going to be tied to your land in a bad way.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Shalom Holtz, and we'll be discussing an article that he wrote for the Journal of Biblical Literature. I think a pretty cool thing that I get an opportunity every once in a while to see in some of the things that I get to read for the podcast is maybe we do a little bit too much work to find significance or what we think is significant in biblical text. And I think sometimes, and this is one of these cases, understanding the biblical world as it is in a kind of a mundane way. Just as an example, in this case, we're talking about land ownership. And so in 1,000 years, in 5,000 years, whatever, archaeologists who are sifting through our data are going to look for these things to understand how we lived day-to-day life. And that is important. And it's important to keep in mind that we should not assume everything about their world was like our world. And then from there, you get theology, kind of as a bonus. But you have to look into the mundane and banal parts of life. So that said, any feedback, guest suggestions, or just want to tell me about your day, reach out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Shalom Holtz. Shalom E. Holtz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor of Bible at Yeshiva University in New York City. I have a BA from Harvard University in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and a PhD in the same field from the University of Pennsylvania. My areas of research are ancient Near Eastern law, specifically the Neo-Babylonian period in Akkadian, but ranging far beyond that, and the connections between Near Eastern law and the law in the Hebrew Bible, and as meaningful context. So I've written 2 studies on court procedure in the Neo-Babylonian period, one of kind of a synthetic study and the other a collection of primary sources, and then a book-length work on prayer in the Hebrew Bible, and the motif of the courtroom in prayer in the Hebrew Bible, in light of the ancient Near Eastern parallels.
I definitely want to get my hands on that. That sounds interesting.
The book is called Praying Legally.
Okay. Okay. I'll make a note of that when I'm editing, because I'm gonna want to find a copy of that. So I love a good segue that I can then interrupt and then call out and then use. And so, talking about law, so we're going to be discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Problems of Land Possession and the Meaning of Isaiah 60, verse 21. Can we just begin with what's happening in Isaiah 60 and that gets us to verse 21, and then we can kind of move in the direction of where your article is discussing that?
Sure. So Isaiah 60 is um, a vision of the restoration of Jerusalem. It's addressed to uh, Zion, Jerusalem, um, and the prophet imagines a kind of really a full-on new order, um, uh, where once it was abandoned and so on. Now it's going to be gloriously restored. The sun won't set, uh, and God will be the city's eternal light. And part of and that brings us to the particular verse, is imagines the people who were living in that, who are going to live in that city, right? Your people shall be in the right, all be in the right. They shall possess the land for all time. They are the shoot that I planted, my handiwork in which I glory. That's God addressing Zion. So the way I see it, the big question was always surrounding this word that I rendered as be in the right, Hebrew word tzadikim, which on some level uh, can signal that notion of what should we say, moral correctness or being right morally, but has its origins in the legal sphere, and specifically in the courtroom, where the person designated in Hebrew as tzaddik is actually the person who is declared to be in the right. Famously, the example is in the book of Deuteronomy, which describes how when people come to court, there's one is declared right and the other is declared wrong, or in the wrong, right? And the words used there are the same as the words for righteous and even evil, right? Tzaddik, righteous, and Rasha, evil. But the base meaning, I think, is evident in Deuteronomy 25:1, where you have them going into court, and one is right and one is wrong, and that's what happens, and that's just the outcome of a legal proceeding. And so I make the connection there. My suggestion in the article is that we apply that sort of more legal meaning here in our verse, and understand this as a reference to litigation surrounding ownership of land, or possession of the land for all time. To do that, I first of all, kind of I begin with the philology, or I don't actually. The article doesn't begin that way, but it's kind of at root is the question: Can you make this claim based on the language? But really, what happens is you kind of read the language together with what you know is going on in what I believe to be the period to which this verse and the entire prophecy addresses itself, which is the period of the end of the Babylonian exile. So the beginning of the Persian, what we call the Persian period, or the Persian Empire, and the what's described elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible as a return, right? In modern Israeli Hebrew refers to it as the return to Zion, right? Shivat Zion. And the kind of the new perspective, besides the perspective on the Hebrew, is that we now have a good amount of documentation in cuneiform, and actually even outside of cuneiform, for what it meant to possess land, or what relationship people had with land under the Persian Empire, and even before that. Some of this comes from long known documents, but such as from the archives from Elephantine, and from the cuneiform archives of the Murashu family, from Nippur, which are roughly contemporaneous, kind of early Persian period. But but we also have even earlier material, which is lately being published from a site called Yahudu, Al Yahudu, uh, which is a site somewhere in Mesopotamia. Its precise location is unknown because the texts themselves were not excavated through scientific excavation, but the materials attest to a group of people with names that incorporate the name of the God of Israel, sometimes known as Yahwistic names. People with Yahwistic names living in Mesopotamia, in a place called Yahudu, which is just the cuneiform equivalent of, or the Babylonian equivalent of Judah. Right, so they've got a little town called Judah in Mesopotamia, and so these documents are remarkably important for so many reasons. Among them, I think, because they allow us, in the context of a discussion of Isaiah, especially the part Isaiah 40 to the end of the book, 40 to 66, are they are they are likely to have been people who, contemporary with the audience that Isaiah was addressing himself to in that particular period. So, in light, and what we find there, among things that we find, is that they were not really landowners. They were granted land from the various governments already under the Persian period, or the Persian Empire's predecessors, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, resettled their exiles. Right, they're the ones who conquered Judah and exiled the Judeans, brought them to Mesopotamia, and employed them, used them as part of a land reclamation scheme, in which they granted these people plots of land, and they were for the cost of for taxation, with the cost of having to pay taxes to the powers that be, they also were able to subsist on this land. And studies of the corpus in general, and here I'll particularly signal the very important work of Tiro Alstola entitled Judeans in Babylonia, which suggests that they had a status that was not, they were not slaves, right? They weren't they were not formally enslaved in any way, but they were tied to this land because it was, as far as we know, it was inalienable. Right, you couldn't sell it, which meant that even if you couldn't cover your debts that you might have incurred, they were basically tied to this land, and we even have examples of people having to mortgage actually mortgage their property, but like they lease it back from the people who held the pledge. Right, so you I mortgage my property, and then I have to lease it back from someone. So you end up working on the land that you once originally held. Now you're working for the guy who's holding it as a security for a loan, or held it for a security loan, kind of repossessed it, basically.
So let me make sure I get, because this is a pretty sharp departure from the contemporary American understanding of, like, it's a free market exchange. I want to buy this land from someone. I buy this land, and the taxes they're not a condition of my owning that land. It's just a result, necessarily, I maybe, of me owning that land. But this is the land was granted under
Right.
imperial. Is that how would we?
Ultimately, yes. Right.
Okay.
Right. I'm not. I couldn't tell you exactly how it actually happened. I'm sure somebody among the listeners, and if there's a scholarly listener out there who can give me some more details on that, would be great. But yes, let's call it imperial.
No, let's assume you're the expert here. So
fine. Okay, great.
Because
So
you
yes,
certainly are. You certainly are in this conversation.
Okay, so yes, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so an imperial grant of this land, they can't sell it, but they can mortgage it and be liable for some kind of a debt. Uh,
Right.
and
So
just the
they're
produce of the land goes to pay off whatever that debt is, but not the land itself.
correct. They're well, there are the big, probably the most important tax obligation um, is what's known as the troops of the king payment, the tzab, right? And the terminology surrounding this arrangement suggests, and um, that they were funding the military, and it goes so far as to say that certain landholders actually had obligations to appear and serve in the military as well. There's at least some indication that there were people who actually end up going or having to go to meet this obligation as in person, right? Um, and so you have uh, the field. So you end up with a tax obligation, which you have to then pledge this field to secure the loan to you have a tax obligation, you have to borrow to meet that tax obligation because your crops don't produce enough. You end up um, you end up using the field to secure the loan to make that payment, and then you end up the land is somehow repossessed with the landowner covering now the original landowner working on land that they had to lease to cover their debts, essentially.
So it's all of this for a conquered people being subject to a foreign power and not in control of their own land and therefore their own destiny and probably their family's destiny. Is that what's in the background here?
I believe so. Yes. Um, in many ways, and I think one of the things that the cuneiform records that are emerging contribute to this discussion is that this entire part of the book of Isaiah seems to be um, contending against the claims of the rising Persian Empire. Um, you can talk about it kind of from above, if you will, kind of on the theological plane, that the God of Israel is contending with claims of the foreign gods, and that you see that throughout the book of that part of Isaiah. There's this contest of, you want to call it, contest of divine wills. Um, and but you also see it from below, I think, in a case like this, right, where the and perhaps more subtly, right, that the prophecies are um, undermining, or I wouldn't say undermining, I would say they are envisioning a new world order uh, for this, um, you know, people in exile. For the return is now viewed as kind of is going to be a complete change. That's what the point of chapter 60 in general is, a kind of a total, full-on transformation. Anything you thought was once the case is now going to be completely different.
So it's like a subversion of what you know
Yes,
to be the case. Okay.
exactly.
I hope this doesn't mess up the flow because I have other questions that would probably work better. But so there's this. I think it's Sasenu.
Shushanu.
Okay, what is that? And maybe you've already talked about it because I
Right. So
mispronounced it.
the Shushanu is just the status that the term that's used by um, the term that's used in the record, in some of the records related to this land for service arrangement, to designate the people who are uh, who possess the land, right? Who are in charge of who are who's the grantees, right? That's probably the best way to think of it. That's the status that they have.
Is it like being a serf?
Kind of. I think that's not a bad way to think about it. Yeah, I think that's probably a decent way to think about it. Is kind of that they have a sort of a serf status. Yes. Um, they get to use the land, but they have other obligations. They have obligations to someone higher up the chain. How about that?
And they get to use the land, and they're also they're stuck with this land.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Um, so I guess so. In the larger ancient Near East, is
Hmm.
there enough overlap between the different legal systems and concepts of law that, like, so you're essentially saying that here in Isaiah 60, this is a commentary on a legal circumstance that people have had to deal with. Is this foreign to their understanding of law, like ancient Israelite understanding of law, or is it something that they only understand because they've had to deal with it? I'm not sure how to
Right.
word
That's
that.
a good question. I think if I'm understanding correctly, and we can go where you want to go with this. Um, the I think the immediate context for Isaiah 60 is this is the legal reality with which they live, right? This is the how the world in which they see it. How this, whether or not this contrasts, dovetails, echoes anything that they are familiar with from Israelite tradition is really hard to judge based on the chapter, right? Um, I think some of it, um, you know, we could bring in the discussion of, let's say, Leviticus 25, right, where you have the Jubilee laws, which are designed to kind of maintain family relationships to land over the long term, and to undo the effects that might have come because someone had to sell his property to uh, to cover debts or whatever. And then the Jubilee Law's vision, at least, is that there's kind of a giant reset every 50 years, right? That might be something that kind of falls into here. Now, whether or not the audience in Isaiah 60 is or even Isaiah 60 is aware of it is a bigger question that I think we can get into here. But that you might want to bring that in here.
Yeah, man. There's a there's a lot to this. So you did mention, you could talk about theology. So how much of a departure from what you're saying would talking about theology be, or is this an instance where it's all the same thing? If we're talking about laws, we are inevitably talking about whatever deity or deities the people in question worshipped or believed in.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You
Well,
maybe
so
elaborate a little bit.
we have a concept, I think, in the modern world that like theology is over there and
Hmm.
law is over here.
Okay.
But for something like land possession, it's tied up in. You can't even say religious identity because religious identity is tied to, well, this is who you are. You're a people who are, like when you're in the land. The presence of your deity is there, and all of these rules and laws are meant to drive that you are the people of that deity. So it's is it
I
possible
think
to
I understand.
disentangle? Okay, yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
go.
think I think
Or
I
I'll
understand.
just keep rambling.
You'll just keep drilling if you need to. Um, so um, the the prophecy, at least, is imagining a return to the native land, right? To the land, right? To Jerusalem, to Zion, whatever you want there. Um, under uh, the political reality is going to be that, or the political reality as we would imagine it would be, right? Not going to be, is that they are going to be subjects of the empire, right? Of the Persian Empire, because it just so happens, or I don't know if it just so happens, but history is that um, the Persian Empire encompasses now not just Babylonia, but also um, Judea, and there is the opportunity, however this works, for return. Right, you can now the Persian Empire is allowing repatriation, and uh, now Isaiah is saying in chapter 60 that the you're going to not only are you going to return, you're going to even we're even going to imagine a world in which the realities of empire, the legal realities of empire, are going to be changed, right? They're going to change so much so almost beyond recognition, right? A new way to think of this, right? You're not going to be tied to your land in a bad way, right? You are now you're going to be tied to the land because you are native shoots of that land, or your children will be native shoots of that land. You won't have to worry about um, claims against your land, right? Kind of, what I call the guarantees of free title, of clear title, right? That you're not going to sort of God's guarantee of free title, as it were.
I'm
Now, is that um, yeah, okay, that's where I'm going to stop there.
You don't have to stop.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So I do kind of want to hear more about. It seems like there's a juxtaposition between being tied to the land in a negative way and being tied to the land in a positive way.
Hmm.
Does this only come about as a result of things like exile, or is that already an idea before in the historical record?
There's stuff to be said on both sides of that, the bad way and the good way, right? On the bad side, one imagines that even in ancient, even before the exile, but and after it too, I guess, the realities were not necessarily that everybody could meet everybody's debts, right? Just based on working the land, and that this situation was quite common, right? The situation of um, people struggling to keep a hold on the land. I don't think that's tied necessarily to any particular. Uh, um, let's say it this way. I think it's pretty well nigh universal that this was the kind of situation in a uh, in a society that's so different from in the societies with which we're dealing in the biblical period. That's the bad side. So I don't know that exile has any difference there. Um, on the good side, uh, um, I think the vision of so the vision of return doesn't happen unless you've been taken away, right? So yes, and to that extent, yes, return requires some kind of idea of exile and perhaps the experience of exile. The landholding reality, um, one could be. I don't think that's directly linked to the exile. The new vision. I don't think is the new vision of landholding. I don't think is linked to the new reality.
I don't
It doesn't
think
have to be linked to the new reality.
I don't think I've ever realized this association until just now in this conversation.
Hmm.
But a few years ago, a podcast about attempts at utopia came
Right.
out, and they were
Hmm.
talking about like the Oneida
Hmm.
folks in upstate New York, and I'd never really thought, but I think I just implicitly always believed that ancient Israel had a kind of a utopian vision to it. However, there are these elements to it that seem to accept almost inevitability, the inevitable aspects of human life. Like you say, people are going to fail to pay debts at some point, and as a result, are going to sell off property that should stay in familial hands. So, I guess, in your opinion, and you can say pass, that's fine. But in your opinion, are these things are they built into the system initially, or do you think these are things that are added in response to seeing that kind of thing happen? And if there's no historical record, then again, you can say pass.
I would say that from my understanding of the archaeology and the and just my reading of the biblical corpus, the work, the written work, it seems to me that that the Bible presents an ideal that is fully aware uh, of the non of the fully aware. It presents an ideal that is fully aware of the realities, right? So that um, you know I can't tell you that the legislation that that the particular laws that we talked about in Leviticus 25 that they were ever implemented, letter for letter, word for word. But I can say they do represent a certain ideal in response to a situation that must have been on the ground. Um, in the case of Isaiah 60, I think my point was simply to say, let's talk about they shall take possession they shall possess the land for all time, right? Well, what does that mean, possessing the land for all time? We could read that as something pie in the sky, right? Possessing the land, well, some even would say that it has nothing to do with a particular geographic plot, or anything on this earth at all, but simply something about what I called a non-material eschatological sense. And somebody even goes on to say, like, possessing the world, right? Take over the world, as being seen in that verse. Um, uh, um, the my reading of it is that this has actually does have to do with the material, something very material, right? And some earlier commentators had noticed this possibility, that possessing land meant something to do with land ownership, right? Some kind of something, right? Some kind of anchor in this world, right? Something very material. How about that as a single word that we can talk about, right? Something material had something to do with meant something material. So and so I suggested that let's ask the question, kind of with my imagination here. You're coming to address, or the prophet is coming to address a people who are, by the prophet's own description, downtrodden, right? And uh, you come to them with this glorious vision. If there is a pie in the sky chapter, it's Isaiah 60, right? How does that land, as they say? How does that land with an audience that is struggling to make ends meet? How about that? And so, uh, as I say, right, the idea of kind of divine radiance kind of lands kind of flat, or falls flat, or almost meaningless when the realities are darker, right? You kind of expect, you kind of hope that Isaiah has something to say to speak to the actual situation, and I hear in that verse, I hear it. In Isaiah 60:21, I hear something about land possession in a very concrete, material sense.
Yeah, and so I mean, you did kind of touch on this, and I am kind of curious about this. I know it was in somewhere in the questions that I sent you.
Mm.
I guess the idea of like an eschatological idea. Have there been have material or immaterial or spiritual, however you want to characterize that, interpretations, have they waxed and waned throughout history? And obviously, I'm talking here about Jewish interpretation. Have they waxed and waned, and were there certain circumstances that that happened under?
Um, I'm not fully aware of the full range of interpretations of the verse.
Fair enough.
Um, uh, so I couldn't tell you historically. I wouldn't venture to guess. What historical circumstances and plotting that. That would be a very interesting undertaking, actually. How do people read this? But I will say that um, among the modern commentaries that I read, I did not see anything that wedded a particular context or even a particular faith commitment to a particular reading. In other words, you find material readings across the gamut. You find, and you find what one might call less material, or what I said, eschatological, and so on. Readings across the gamut of circumstances: Jewish, non-Jewish, Israeli, non-Israeli, whatever. Yeah, it's hard to. I don't think it maps. Um, as far as I can see, it wasn't something I actually tried to do, but as far as I can see, I don't think it maps neatly in any historical circumstance.
Yeah, that's fair. I think what I was envisioning as you were talking about different ways of interpreting it is like I could definitely see someone latching onto a less material understanding of it if you are an Eastern European Jew who's in fear of pogroms. And it's, if I'm educated and I can be employable anywhere in the world, that could be, in some metaphorical sense, this guarantee of land. I know that even if I have to run away, I can still make a living and feed my family, and finding some comfort in this idea that maybe there's, you know divine love coming to you or a divine promise coming to you in that way.
Well, let's remember there's two things going on here. Number one, yes, the new relationship to land, but that's the article, right? But the article is built on the prophecy itself, which is about returning to Zion, right? So, um, so the audience is likely to have been in exile, not in Zion, possible, very likely. Um, and so there's almost like a double um, restoration going on, right? You're going to come back, and the conditions of returning are going to be different. There are those who would read this chapter as belonging to the part of the book that is which was written to an audience of returnees who have already returned and who are now living in this reality in uh, you know in the province of Judea in the Persian period. Um, and so there's, so it's not the Babylonian situation. It's simply the reality living there, and that it's still life is not as good as we thought, and yet I'm coming here to comfort you, and so on, says Isaiah. So either way, right? I would say it would be, I couldn't point to a specific example, but I'm certain that the modern Zionist movement saw, kind of with the return to Israel, saw that drew inspiration from a verse like this, from chapters like this, right? From Isaiah 60.
Do we know, say, Second Temple period? Do we know
Mm.
much about how was there overlap with a group like the Essenes or something where obviously they were in the land, they were occupying the land, but
Mm-hmm.
were they pointing to this to say like we haven't met what's said is what is promised here?
So I don't know. I'm not that
Okay.
familiar with the history of interpretation, as I've been saying.
Yeah. Sorry.
Right. No, that's fine. That's fine. I couldn't say, but what I could tell you is that uh, if you go read chapter 60 very, without too much, you don't have to be terribly close reading of it, right? It imagines something quite miraculous, right? And, the sun won't set, right? God will be your eternal light, and so on. Um, so, and the kind of the power dynamic, the reversal of the power dynamic, or the inversion of the power dynamic, that now the city once subject is now going to become the overlord, right? That's a huge theme in the chapter throughout, right? That reversal of fortune, right? Complete reversal of fortune is something that would likely have spoken to um, anyone chafing under empire.
Okay. I'm sorry. I keep going back to the interpretation thing. I just
That's fine. It's
yeah.
fine.
I get I work myself into this hole where I'm like, how would people have experienced this? But you did mention, so you just kind of briefly touched on the section, and as you were saying that, I caught out of the corner of my eye in one of my questions, Deutero Isaiah. From your perspective,
Hmm.
um, how do you see Isaiah as far as like how many parts do you see to
Yeah.
Isaiah? How relevant is that to this overall?
So it's relevant to so I would say that Isaiah 40 to 66 are different, are different from the first half, from 1 to 39. It's a very likely a different prophet. Um, whether or not there are two prophets working in that section of 60 to 40 to 66, and the delineation of the demarcation of where one stops and the other begins is, let's just say I'm still agnostic on that question. I'm still thinking about that question. The material realities that I suggest apply to the verse are relevant whenever one would date, uh, whatever your position. I think whatever one's position is on the question of, whose hands we're looking, whose work are we reading in Isaiah 40 to 66. The material realities are fairly stable, sufficiently stable across the broad time span, of the, let's take it, the end of the 6th century, the beginning of the 5th century, and so on, that I'm happy to. I think they apply no matter what, without taking too much of a staking too much of a claim on that question.
You said something in there that I hope that you will be. I hope that you can expound on,
Sure.
and here's some setup for it. So,
Hmm.
I was reading something yesterday, and I guess this is just a thing I missed. But like in First Kings, there's a story about a prophet and a man of God.
Hmm.
Okay, I don't think in my childhood education of the Bible that I got the understanding that prophets were anything other than like super important guys, and of course we'd know their name because why wouldn't God let us know their name? So when you say, I think this is a different prophet. So I, I guess what does that mean overall? But then what can you say about like prophets and prophecy in general? How pervasive was that in the ancient world?
Um, okay, so
Yeah, I know.
uh, on the subject of this was a different prophet, I would simply say that from where I'm reading this, for whatever one believes about prophecy, and what it represents as a communication of divine word, however you understand that, the critical point is communication, and it has to be understood. Yes. So when, let's just take a different chapter in Isaiah, chapter 45, names a man named Cyrus, right, and calls that man God's anointed. Yes. Um, in chapter 45, verse 1. So the the it presumes that someone listening to it, let's say listening, reading, encountering that, um, has some real reference that means something, right? If you tell me a man named Cyrus, I know who that man is, right? I can, that's not a name that I drew out of a hat. It's something that's meaningful to you. You are experiencing Cyrus, and here, this is what I think about Cyrus, right? Um, that seems to be the and so for the prophecy to be relevant, and if you want to call it this, for God's word to be relevant, it makes no sense that the same guy who's talking about Sennacherib is going to talk about Cyrus, right? One is too early, the other's too late, right? Um, uh, okay. Then you ask the question of, would people have known about prophets? Is that what was that the question was?
I think it just seemed like a celebrity status in my head until I started to hear experts talk about it.
I don't know that that's the case. Um, I don't know how. I mean, uh, um, I think the the surest claim for celebrity status is post-canonical, right? Once you made it into the collection, then yes, you have celebrity status. Whether or not you did beforehand, take the example of Jeremiah. He was known. He seems to have been known in a certain circle, um, not necessarily appreciated in that circle, um, to judge it from his own telling. Uh, um, um, Question would be, if we do have some references to prophets outside of the Hebrew Bible, meaning like non-biblical texts in Hebrew that mention uh, a prophet or the prophet from the time, like every here and there. There's a letter from the right around the time of Jeremiah, that just uses the Hebrew word for prophet, talks about the prophet without giving a name. So what does that tell you? Some letter writer knows a prophet or has heard the word of a prophet. Um, I couldn't tell you that they had celebrity status. My sense is that the celebrity status comes afterwards.
That's yeah, no, okay, that's fair. I think also though with the question of this is a different prophet. Okay, cool. So it's uh, assuming we can attribute what scribes are putting on scrolls
Hmm.
to people addressing the public or speaking out in some way.
Hmm.
Uh, a scribe or a group of scribes circulate one scroll, and then something is added later and attributed to the same prophet. And I think what's interesting about that is that it seems from a modern perspective to be dishonest, but it doesn't seem like that was considered to be a bad faith practice in the ancient world. Is that fair to say?
Look, at some point, someone did this, right? This happened. Um, is there an Isaiah school, for example, right? Some modern interpreters have suggested that there is some kind of, there are linguistic continuities across the entire book, right? Certain features that recall earlier material. So is that how this happened, right? At some point, and I don't know that it's necessarily as nefarious as it sounds when you present it, as somebody did it without telling me, right? I think they might have honestly thought that. That all this stuff belongs together in some way as the prophecy of Isaiah. I don't know. I'm not such a great authority on like what notions of authorship and how important authorship was. But my understanding is that it's only it's much more important in more recent history than it was in the biblical period.
And so to bring it back to the article, it could be that this section is it shares that, okay, it's attributed to Isaiah because it's critiquing power that is abusive and disadvantageous to the people of Israel, and it finds its foundation in the shared practices and beliefs and identity that have developed over time of what Israel is. Is that a fair way?
Yeah.
And that may be
I
how
think
they
I
end
think
up
it's
together.
more than that. I think there's language that connects it across. Like it's not just a common ideology that's there, right? It's not like you could take part of Jeremiah and pass it off as Isaiah, right?
Yeah.
There is a style that I think that connects Isaiah to connects the book across the board. And that may be because I've always thought of it that way. Couldn't I part of it must be that I've always thought of it. Oh, this is Isaiah, not somebody else. But I don't think. And I would say I would go even further than that. There's important work done by Benjamin Summer. I would recommend this actually. Benjamin Summer, A Prophet Reads Scripture, who talks about how it seems pretty clear that this part of Isaiah has access to Jeremiah, but he does things with it, right? But he's interpreting it, and other earlier prophecies as well, including the first half of the book. So, so you can tell when he's reading somebody else, right? So you couldn't just take, you couldn't just pass off any old prophet and tag it on here as somebody else's work. No, it's got something that something is pushing you to put it together with this book and not tag it onto Jeremiah, for example. Could it be that they didn't believe that it was by Jeremiah? Sure, could be that. But there's also, there's even if I don't assume any of that, if I just look at the way they write or the way they talk or whatever you want to, their words, right? There are differences that might have prevented someone from, simply passing off anybody's work as this.
I think my description may have just exposed, I don't know, my emphasis on core values or something like that at the expense of what would have mattered to ancient scribes who are compiling these things, and ancient people who are hearing and engaging with them in the way that they would, which is, I mean, it's
to the extent we can know that.
Yeah, right. I keep finding out that it's not a mistake for me to think the way that I think, but I'm going to keep running into resistance when I try to use the way that I think to understand how ancient people thought, and get in a conversation with someone like you. The way that ancient people think, and you're also
I wish.
respectful.
All
Well,
I know is I know how they
hold on, hold
write.
on. You're
All I know is I know
respectful.
how they write. I will
Yeah,
say this though, and I think the flip side to the, utter difference, of between me and the author of whatever biblical text I'm reading, or if you want to go even further, whatever ancient text I'm reading. The flip side to that, and I think the justification for the entire enterprise that is, contextual biblical study, and contextual study of the ancient world in general, is that in the end of the day, these are humans, right? So despite so I talk about this when I teach the letters from the city of Mari, on the site on the Middle Euphrates, very important in the 18th century BC, right? Conquered by Hammurabi of Babylon. But the letters that are written at that time, we have like royal correspondence that are in Akkadian. Besides all the important information that they tell us about the history and so on, can talk all kinds of things there. But you read one of those letters, and or any letter in Akkadian, really. Take your pick of the letters. These are correspondence. A writing to B, husbands writing to wives, wives writing to husbands, and once you overcome the language, right? Once you've gotten the language, you understand, you can read the language. Part of what makes them readable is the fact that these are humans with human concerns, right? That and we haven't changed that much, right? Wives complaining, send more money. You're off on business, you leave me here alone, right? You take care of yourself, right? And so those kinds of things, at least we have to start with that. Otherwise, we have no purchase on this material whatsoever, right? We have no handle, right? We have no way of getting to this, right? If we don't think that these are humans talking to humans, then for those for whom this is important, if you have a God talking to humans, great. God has to talk to the humans at that period, right? So I often ask my students, why didn't God give the Hebrew Bible in French or Chinese or even in English, right? Like, why is it written in Hebrew, right? And so my point is that yes, because that's the group of people that had to understand it. It's the group of people who speak Hebrew, right? So if you want from the theological perspective, right? There is this, you want to say God needs to be understood, God wants to be understood, however you want to understand this, right? The book was meant to be understood, and so and I proceed from there, and that so they're human and they spoke a real language, and that we should try to understand it as close as possible to human language.
And it's a challenge to understand even them.
Well,
And
I think that if you landed one of them you taught them modern American English, right? They'd be face the same challenges. It's just a question of what is yes, I speak English, I read English, I've learned the English, but this is a completely different thing. I need to understand, what does this mean, right? So I think
yeah, no, people are people, and we're not that special. That's what I like to say.
Mm.
Because I kind of Mr. Magoo my way through interviews,
Mm-hmm.
I like to add this in there. Is there anything from the article you were hoping I would ask about that I didn't? I think we actually covered a lot of the questions that I sent to you, but that doesn't mean that you weren't hoping something important to you
I would say
that I
that
missed.
there's one little bit that I think might be interesting, is the specifics of like, what does possession mean, and might it have to do not only with just simply possession outright, but also in the simplest sense, but even possibly the possibility that this could refer to possession through inheritance, that is passing it on to the next generation.
Thank you.
And that there's some possibility, the Hebrew allows it, and there is some possibility interbiblically and extra biblically, if the work of my colleague James Moore, whose work a little bit inspired this article, was there a concern about not just possessing ownership, but also possessing in the sense of ownership, but also possessing in the sense of giving it over, passing it on to the next generation, and that might have been an issue, a live issue at that point. And the article stands whether or not you talk about inheritance law, right, or inheritance practices, but I think there is that dimension is possibly out there, alongside the broader theme of land ownership and the problems of land ownership.
So I guess the question there then would be, when imperial, or however we want to describe it, when the imperial decree granting the land to Jared comes down, does that mean the successors of Jared are also going to be bound to the land in that same way? That's what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, can Jared then bequeath it to his sons?
Okay.
Right? Is Jared allowed to bequeath the land to the next generation, or does he require imperial authorization to do that? Right?
Okay.
In other words, do you have to go through, right? Do you have to have, is it just simply natural that, Jared, as we say in Hebrew, after 120 years, um, passes on to his fate, and or dies, as we say in modern English, right? Um, and Jared's children want to continue working on this land, right? Can they simply take possession of it? Can they simply just move on, right? Or is there a requirement that the empire, from imperial authorities for authorization of that, right? Or and um, so some recent scholarship has raised the question, the possibility, has found in documents the possibility of a requirement to get imperial authorization. Now, I don't know how, I'm not sure how how the chips will fall on that particular question. It's still a question, but if it turns out that possibility that I couldn't simply take possession as a child of my parents' landholding. I'd have to somehow get imperial authorization for that, right? Then there's an extra step that reinforces imperial authority through land ownership. Right? It's never smooth. There's always another step you have to take if they're right about this whole point. Um, so I raise it because it uses a verb there in the Hebrew that might mean to inherit land, not just possess land. So that kind of opens that door up. If you understand what I'm saying. But it may very well be that we may learn that this idea that they required imperial authorization was really not is all a figment of our modern scholarly imagination. And in the end of the day, everybody understood that people inherited their parents naturally, right? And there was the empire didn't intervene in that whole question. You still get into the question of, this is not your land in the end of the day, right? This is not your, you are working on an imperial plot, and it's not yours, and you could end up stuck with it, right? Because you're under obligation to the empire, even if it has nothing to do with passing it on to your children.
So it's not an issue of an added layer of onerous legal process in
It could
either
be.
direction.
It
It
could
could
be.
be, but that's not that wouldn't be the core of the critique. The core of the critique in either way
Yeah.
is we're on land to which we do not belong,
Right.
and does not actually belong to us. We are subject to something other than our God,
Mm-hmm.
and our land is owned by someone other than our God, and is therefore could be a burden to
Correct.
us.
Correct.
Okay.
And one way to think of it is simply it's a burden, right? That it's a problem, and you know, and um, one option is that it's just a burden, and it's like it's a burden. Owning land is a pain, no matter what. And and this prophecy is saying, this is yours now, and it's really not. You're gonna be free of those problems. Another option is the particular circumstance of this moment of imperial land and so on and so forth, right? And you're not, um, and we're going to end that arrangement, right? That arrangement's over. It's yours, free and clear. A third possibility, kind of a subset of the second possibility, is that one manifestation of those problems, of the imperial problem, is passing it on to the next generation, and that you are, because the text deals with that verse deals with, it mentions the shoots, it mentions the next generation. It seems to, um, without too much of a stretch, touch on that issue. I suggested possibly that there was this additional um, connection here to a particular aspect of imperial domination.
Thank you for bringing that up. It was in the back of my head, and then I forgot it because I distracted myself with other questions.
Sure.
Some of which were helpful, some of which were not. So you already touched on a couple, but where would you send people? And it doesn't have to just be on the subject of this article, but just in
Mm-hmm.
general, the things that you're interested in professionally. Where would you send people to read, watch, listen, and learn more about those things?
So I really wish I knew read, watch. Read, I know, but watch and listen, I wish I had more about. But read, I certainly would recommend. I already mentioned Ben Summers' book. Um, I happen to be a big fan of the Oxford Jewish Study Bible, as a both the commentaries that they put in there on the different books, as well as the series of essays that they have, are really valuable. In terms of context, I think, and I just simply stuck to Isaiah for the minute. I think my very good friend Sean Astor wrote a very important book on the first part of Isaiah, um, called Reflections of Empire in Isaiah 1 to 39. It's published by the Society of Biblical Literature in 2017. And it gets down into the nitty gritty of, if you know what the rhetoric of empire was during the Neo-Assyrian period, which is the period to which that part of Isaiah addresses itself, then you begin to understand just how subversive that part of Isaiah is, in that it takes the same rhetoric down to to language that sometimes seems opaque, but only makes sense once you read it together with the Assyrian. And that's the kind of work that can be done when you have a grasp of the kind of the rich context in which these in which these prophets are operating. And you obviously have to, you know, you proceed from a point of view of, especially from the point of view of, there is a historical context and it's a particular one, and to some extent it changes, and there are more texts that are more relevant or less relevant. But once you can do that kind of thing, then you really can appreciate just how certain things really do now make sense.
I think that is when I get my most excited.
Mm.
Talking to you guys is when when I get to find out, like, hold on, let's zoom out 30,000 feet. Let's look at the world around this thing. Oh, wow, there's so much here. And I think you're right. I think there are too few options in the watch listen. I do know Biblical World. They do a lot of really good stuff that I don't think people would just think to look into about the biblical world. Like, I think for months they've been walking through Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, on their podcast. And so I think a lot of ground level engagement with biblical texts in people's lives has maybe been a little bit condescending to them. I think you would find that most people are really interested in the historical, linguistic, cultural things. Once they get going learning about those things, I don't think most people want to stop. And that has been my experience outside of this podcast, talking to people when they're like, what is this podcast? And I take a deep breath and I'm like, I don't want to tell you what it's not. So here's all the things that I want to engage with on. And they're like, oh, what about this? And I'm like, I haven't had a chance to talk about that yet. So I do want you to know there is an interest out there. And I just hope as younger people get into the academy or scholastic approaches to the Bible that we'll see more of that watch, listen, and they'll be talking about your work, sir.
I don't know about that, but
so, and I know that you've heard this question because you heard the initial time that I asked it, what I like to call the John D. Levinson question. What do you read for fun?
Historical fiction. Ken Follett has two really great historical fiction series. The Kingsbridge series is one that I really like, and the other is the 20th century. There's a 20th century trilogy that is also, found it very remarkably a lot of fun to read. So those are so Dickens is one, not necessarily historical fiction, but then the other is the Ken Follett, that type of genre that imagines a world that is sort of somewhat anchored in the history, but has fun with it.
Nice. I appreciate you being here, and unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Next week is my conversation with Jason Borges on his article, Phoebe, a Host of Christian Travelers. So here is a quick preview of that conversation. Thanks and take care.
Yeah. So yeah, essentially my argument is trying to define this word and imagine what did Paul mean by it, and then specifically why did Paul use this word to describe Phoebe? Kind of what's this word doing for him rhetorically? So basically, I can talk about some of the previous interpretations in the past. This word prostatis has been translated sometimes as helper. The older translations, which has a more kind of subordinate, diminutive role, as if she was kind of like, Paul's secretary type of thing. And there's been a reaction against that because the word prostatis that he calls Phoebe is the feminine form of this another Greek word prostates, which just simply means someone who stands in front or is a leader, as a benefactor of some kind. And so now I think it's pretty common in translations for it to be translated as patron or benefactor, which I think is accurate. But then the question becomes, in what way was she a patron or a benefactor? In what ways did she use her money and her prominence in order to support others? And so, there's different explanations for that. Some people just kind of leave it general. She was an affluent person who used kind of her largesse to do good. Robert Jewett will talk more specifically that she was going to be a patroness or a sponsor for Paul's mission to Spain as he was looking to go further west. Others would talk about, how she hosted the weekly Christian gathering in her house, which is plausible as well. And so I think those all could be a part of it, but that's not specifically what Paul has in mind. I think Paul specifically has in mind that she is a host of she is a host of Christian travelers who are coming in and out of Corinth through the port city of Cenchreae, where she is based at and where she lives at. And so I take it to mean that she is a host of Christian travelers, which is kind of given away in the title of my paper there. And so I think this makes the most sense. We can talk about it, because it explains, Paul says she was a prostatis to both me and others. So how was she a patron to both Paul and others, looking in the past? And then looking forward, what is the function of Paul's words choice as he is writing this to the Romans? Why does Paul want the Romans to know her as a prostatis and specifically know that she has been one to both Paul and to other people? How does that work into his kind of rhetoric and his, theological aims within the letter? So what I'm proposing, I just want to be clear, is not like new or novel. Other people have said that. The earliest one that I saw was Origen, so early 3rd century, and other commentators have kind of mentioned it. But it's usually gets like a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of like, this is probably most plausible. And so I wanted to move it from kind of from plausible to more probable. And so look at any potential evidence that there is to support this idea that she actually was a host within the Christian community and helping out Christian travelers who were coming in and out of Corinth. So that's kind of what I was looking to do with this article here.